Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening or this early afternoon, I suppose, depending on where you're joining from. We're going to get started. My name is Judah Schept. Really excited to welcome everyone here this evening to the launch of this fantastic book called Set the Earth on Fire, The Great Anthracite Coal Strike of 1902 and the Birth of the Police. This is, of course, David Correia's new book, which is out as of this summer from Haymarket Press. And you can go and buy that, of course, at any point at haymarketbooks.org. I think the link will be dropped in the chat on the YouTube stream, maybe throughout the event this evening. So I'm going to do some very light moderation here at the beginning to get us going, first by introducing the panelists, and then asking David to start us off by discussing a little bit about what brought him to the research at the beginning, and maybe to lay out some of the broader arguments or themes or interventions the book is making. After David does that, Kim, who I'll introduce here in a moment, and myself and David will have about, 45 minutes or so to chat together about some of these larger themes and questions the book raises, and then we will open it up for questions. Although if you have questions as we're discussing, you definitely do not need to wait until that point. You can put them right in the chat. So let me take a moment and introduce us. Again, my name is Judah. I'm a professor in the School of Justice Studies at Eastern Kentucky University. I tend to study and write and teach and be active around issues of the prison industrial complex, and in particular, the political economy and cultural politics of prison and jail growth and expansion, as well as all kinds of sort of abolitionist interventions into it. I had a book come out a couple years ago now called Coal Cages Crisis, which looked in particular at the extraction and prison economies in Central Appalachia. My fellow panelist tonight barely needs an introduction. It's Kim Kelly, a Philadelphia-based journalist and organizer who writes about labor, politics, food, music, and culture. Her work has appeared in numerous publications, including The Nation, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Baffler, The New Republic, Rolling Stone, Esquire, among many others. And of course, she is the author of Fight Like Hell, The Untold History of American Labor. Welcome, Kim. And then Kim and I are, of course, here to chat with David Correia, the author of Set the Earth on Fire. David's a professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. He's the author of Properties of Violence, co-author with Tyler Wall of Police: A Field Guide, and co-author with Nick Estes, Melanie Yazzie, and Jennifer Dennett-Dale of Red Nation Rising Nation, From Border Town Violence to Native Liberation. He's also a co-founder of Abolish APD, a research and mutual aid collective in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So welcome to us three. Welcome everybody who's tuning in. We're really excited to be here. So David, can you start us off by talking a little bit about how the book took shape, what brought you to do the research in the beginning, and maybe begin to outline some of what you see as the book's major arguments or themes or interventions?
Yeah, thank you, Judah, for the introduction, and thank you for being part of this, and Kim as well. I'm really honored to have you both here. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I can't think of two people I'd rather be talking about this with. And thank you so much to Haymarket for everything that Haymarket's done. I've published with a number of presses, and I've never had a bad experience with Haymarket. They're universally incredible from everyone in that office that I've worked with. And I'm lucky to have had the opportunity to publish with them. This book, I set out to write a completely different book. I've written, as you pointed out in the intro, Judah, I've written a lot about cops and police and policing and police and order, and I write it from as a professor, but also an organizer and a political activist, and I've been involved in anti-police violence movements in Albuquerque, and one of the things I thought about a lot is like how much has been written about the origins of police in the European context of UK, and how little really exists in the US context. There's not a lot, and there's like a small number of texts that constantly get cited when people talk about the origins of police. Usually the Slave Patrol, it's Sally Haddon's book, which ironically, if you read Sally Haddon's book, she actually goes out of her way to say, this is not a story of the origins of police. And yet it's often cited that way. And there's very little effort, I think, scholarly or otherwise, to think about colonial militia as a kind of a genealogy of police. I mean, there's some great stuff that looks at specific agencies like Texas Rangers or Border Patrol. But I was like, I wanted to set out to write a kind of a survey, really, that tried to understand, where do police come from? What are its origin stories? And so I had this like kind of unwieldy book in mind, and I happened to just start in the archives in Pennsylvania, in Western Pennsylvania, actually, at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, which has an incredible collection of United Mine Workers stuff. And because I wanted to know more about the coal and iron police. And if anyone's not familiar, the coal and iron police were a police force in Pennsylvania that existed between the late 1800s to about 1930s. It was a private police force. The state created a statute that gave to coal companies and related industries the right to commission police that they would pay for, but would have public commissions. They would have as the statute said, all the rights of like Philadelphia police, but they would work for the coal companies. And surprisingly, there's actually very little written about the coal and iron police. And so I got in the archives, and I'm not kidding, it took me one day to realize this whole book is about the coal and iron police, particularly because, and this was United Mine Workers stuff, but also they have collections from a lot of coal companies in the archives at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And that's all the Wall Street financiers and the coal company superintendents talked about were two things. One was how to get a compliant workforce and what cops can do for us to do that. And it was constantly about figuring out where to find cops, how to organize cops, the central role of police and policing in producing the kind of like compliant workforce that they were after. And this is like Western Pennsylvania. So this was not related to the 1902 strike, but they were also obsessed with the 1902 strike. And I have to admit, before I got involved in this, I was unfamiliar with the 1902 strike, which, if you were a labor historian working in the early part of the 20th century, this was probably the most important strike in the history of labor. Universally described as like a pivotal turning point for labor, which I think we've lost that. And I think we'll talk about why that might be. But the coal company presidents and their Wall Street financiers recognized that strike was a crucial moment from their perspective to defend their interests, and they used police to do it. And I quote a lot. I use a lot of quotes in the book from those sort of financiers and superintendents, where they talk very specifically about finding non-English speaking miners to interrupt the authority of the Irish and Welsh miners who dominated the United Mine Workers at the time, figuring out ways to divide workers so that they couldn't effectively organize, where to find cops and how to use cops. So that was what, and so I shifted entirely over to this. And what makes this for me so interesting is first the dramatic nature of the strike. This was a 5-month strike in 1902, March to October of 1902. That like upended all industrial activity in the United States at the time. I'll just take us back for a moment. This was a period prior to like oil and gas in which anthracite coal was the most important fuel. And if you're not familiar, anthracite coal, unlike bituminous coal or lignite in Europe, it's a rock. It's called hard rock mining. It burns cleaner with less soot than bituminous, and it actually made industrial production possible. That factories and cities could burn coal, and it wouldn't just, like in Pittsburgh, cover everything with a layer of ash. Every single steamship burned anthracite. Every single blast furnace burned anthracite in the U.S. Every home and hearth used anthracite all up and down the eastern seaboard in the United States. And when 150,000 United Mine Workers went out on strike in March of 1902, they shut down every industry in the United States. And it terrified not just the coal companies who controlled the trade, but every industry, like a cascade of crises that happened. And it shocked, most people, because there had never, up until that point, been that kind of unified strike on the part of the United Mine Workers. They'd never been able to produce that kind of solidarity. And for all kinds of reasons. One of them, of course, was the effectiveness that the coal companies used in dividing miners for all kinds of reasons. One, of course, was really beginning in the 1890s, recruiting Eastern and Central European miners, aggressively recruiting them. And I write about that process in the book. Because the United Mine Workers resisted this and actually lobbied to have them barred from entry to the U.S. because they recognized the difficulty they had organizing these folks. And also the structure of the industry, which we might talk about, but I talk extensively about in the book, that made organizing really difficult. The labor process in the northern coal fields in eastern Pennsylvania were different than in the southern coal fields. The way that miners work and organize themselves were different. And so their complaints and their grievances were different. And it became really difficult for various parts of in the coalfield miners to agree on demands and terms. And often, miners in one coal field in eastern Pennsylvania would put down their tools, and miners in another field would replace them. And so there was just this impossible struggle to produce the kind of solidarity that could result in a strike, like what happened in 1902. So in some ways, it was like this, like they caught lightning in a bottle in 1902, the United Mine Workers. And I should say, as much respect as I have for John Mitchell in the position he was in, it wasn't his accomplishment. It was the rank and file miners' accomplishment. And I hope we talk about that. But if you read histories about this strike, and there aren't many, but if you read them, they're either told in two ways. They're either told from the perspective of the coal company presidents and the mine leaders and the politicians who tried to broker the strike. That's how they're told. Robert Cornell has a book in the 50s. It's the only book-length study of this strike. And I don't think there's a single quote of a single miner. I don't think he even bothered mentioning that there were actual miners working underground. Or it's told as this great victory for labor. It certainly did establish the reputation of the United Mine Workers, which was a very young union at the time. But when I started digging in the archives and reading minutes from various locals from the eastern Pennsylvania coal fields, they told a different story. First, this wasn't a reformist effort to just increase wages or improve working conditions. They wanted to upend the entire industry. They wanted to imagine a much different world for themselves than the one they found themselves in eastern Pennsylvania. And it's a remarkable set of grievances and demands they made. And also, there was a hell of a lot more violence in that strike than anyone's suggested. The United Mine Workers pretended like things were quiet in the coal fields, but there were 10,000 troops and probably the same number of private cops arrayed against 150,000 striking miners all through the coal fields, which is just a small 5-county region in eastern Pennsylvania. So imagine the setting for this. There's 5 small counties in eastern Pennsylvania that produces all the coal that fuels every blast furnace and every steamship that fires itself across the Atlantic, and every home and hearth up in eastern Pennsylvania. Just 5 small counties. And of those 150,000 miners, 70,000 of them didn't speak English. Were from Poland. Poland didn't exist at the time as a country. Russia. They were Ruthenians, Croatians, Lithuanians. Had almost nothing in common. There were so many divisions among the miners, and yet they came together, recognizing the sort of moment that they had, the opportunity they had. And it wasn't like they saw opportunities for great personal wealth. They came together realizing that their lives were on the line, their ability not just to make a living, but to survive as working people were on the line. And so what results is this incredibly dramatic 5-month strike, which they are winning. The United Mine Workers launched this incredible strike, and the only way the coal companies can contest the power of a unified United Mine Workers is by inventing a new kind of police. So the strike ends up becoming a kind of laboratory for a new way to organize cops, imagining them to be on the public payroll, professional, with military experience. They invent what we think of today as SWAT. This is the first regional interagency police department ever invented in the US. Out of this strike, Pennsylvania creates the state police, the first state police in the United States, and they hire one of the colonels who led one of the militias that fought the miners and tried to force them underground. And by the way, that Groom, the guy that created the Pennsylvania State Police, also becomes leads the Eastern State Prison after he creates the. You probably knew that, Judah. I don't. So these are all connected, but and they were very explicit about this. There wasn't like they set out to create a new kind of police. They gave up using the Pinkertons. They understood the limits the Pinkertons could have for them. And so the strike is, number one, just this incredibly dramatic story of 150,000 miners fighting for their lives and creating a kind of solidarity that no one had seen before in the coal fields before. And the coal companies inventing a new kind of police, one that we still have today. All of the basic contours of policing that we recognize as modern police were literally invented as a result of this strike, built on the fly, explicitly so, and that's the story I try to tell in the strike. I mean, in the book, and I try to tell it by focusing not at all. I don't care what Teddy Roosevelt did, and I'm not interested in what all these senators had to say, and what and the National Civic Federation. I'm really interested in what the miners, how they argued on their behalf, how they organized themselves, and they did it against the judgment of their union leaders. They rejected the conservative caution and concerns of their union leaders. They launched a strike that really reshaped the labor movement in the U.S., created the kind of police we know of today, and they did it without any sort of support. It's hard to imagine that this could even have been accomplished given the circumstances, the conditions that they confronted. And so the story is dramatic. I hope that I tell it with all the drama that it deserves, and the real sort of the human cost that those miners stood up for and confronted, and mostly I really wanted to consider the implications and the lasting sort of legacy of that strike, which we've lost in the labor movement. I think that a lot of the history written about the labor movement that we've lost is sort of, number one, the battle between more radical and sort of revolutionary and liberatory elements in the labor movement have always been there, versus the sort of conservative business unionism that held them back and it always won the day until that moment in 1902, and that becomes a really pivotal moment. And without the police that the coal companies invented, we would be living in a much different world. That's the sort of feeling that I have. Like the miners understood what was at stake in the world they were trying to build, and I wish I lived in the world that they wanted to build. But unfortunately, we live in the world that the coal company presidents built for us with their cops. And so that's what I'm trying to do in the book. I wrote this with miners in mind. I got some emails from coal miners during the writing of this book, and I would send them pieces of it. And that's the audience I have in mind. My audience is not college professors. I hope it's read by college professors. I hope it's read in classrooms, but I want it to be read by miners. I want this to be something that union organizers and folks committed to the kind of struggles that the miners waged in 1902, for example, are interested in reading, and that's who I wrote it for. And so I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts about it and talking more about it.
I think that comes through so much. I mean, I'm not an academic, but I loved it. I mean, I'm a little biased in, that I care a lot about coal miners and don't really like the cops. But I think that's a bigger Venn diagram than maybe we'd even imagine. But the one thing that I'm so curious about, especially as someone who's also interested in this history and in finding working people's voices, is where did you find them? Like you mentioned, you kind of teased talking about the archives and doing research, but where were their voices preserved in the first place, and how did you dig them up?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, that's really what preoccupied me. I mean, when I discovered in the archives the sort of these letters back and forth between Wall Street financiers and coal company superintendents, I was struck by the sort of frankness of their conversations. Like they would just say right out in the open, like, we don't want any of these Irish miners. We want miners that don't speak English so that we can interrupt the union. Let's blacklist all these people. Let's hire cops using these private detectives. And I found a lot of the archives are full, just chock full of letters between coal superintendents and Wall Street financiers. And so it makes sense, I suppose, that a lot of histories rely on, the stories that union leaders tell or the coal companies tell. And so I was sort of like flailing about how to tell this story of the strike without resorting to that kind of like material. And the one good thing I say that Teddy Roosevelt did in this case was he manhandled both the coal companies and the union to engage in an arbitration. And so there was this lengthy arbitration that settled the strike. And that arbitration was handled as a kind of court hearing. It was this lengthy court hearing, and so it was transcribed, and it took me months to find the transcription. I mean, I've never. There was a couple of like very old like journal articles about the strike that made one or two references to a transcript. If you Google the Anthracite Coal Commission of 1902, you'll find they published a 200-page book the commission did about its findings, but it's just commission findings. But they had a 10,000-page transcript of the hearings, and those hearings they brought miners, children testified, cops testified, coal and iron cops, Pinkertons testified, superintendents testified. And I'm not sure anyone's ever read this transcript because I found it at the National Archives and it was still sealed. Like, the pages, it looked like it had never been seen. There's some of the Anthracite Heritage Museum in Scranton has some of the volumes of it because it's a 52-volume, 10,000-page transcript. But and that's what I was looking for. I wanted to be able to tell the story from their perspective, and so I spent months just reading this 10,000-page. And by the way, Clarence Darrow, as you know from reading the book, was the union's lawyer. So Clarence Darrow was what came up with the defense, and he brought all these miners on the stand. And Clarence Darrow was both brilliant and hilarious, and very dismissive of the coal company experts that were brought on. And his humor emerges through this transcript. But what was most amazing was just he would ask a Russian miner to come on the stand or a Lithuanian miner and just ask him to tell the story of his experience working in the mines. And I have to tell you, I mean, I spent months trying to read mining manuals about how did they actually mine coal in 1902. It wasn't until I read the transcript and heard them describe it that I finally understood. Because all the mining manuals you'll find online on Google Books written by mining engineers, and they tell you one way that it happens, but the actual miners describing how they did it was a whole other education. And so I thought, this is amazing. I have this 10,000 page archive of the words, their actual words, and I wanted to figure out a way to write about it that honored their words, but didn't just, the usual way that historians write stories like this is just cherry picking quotes and just, like shaping the narrative and using the words of, individual participants in any given historical event to illustrate or to, provide a glimpse to the reader about what it was like. But the author is the expert and, is going to explain that. And I thought, like, I had an opportunity, given the sort of remarkable transcript of their voices, to tell the story differently. And so I tried to, like, put their voices in there unmediated, or if mediated, I would just, like, merge my voice with it, which, I spent a long time thinking about how to do that in a way that doesn't impose myself on their voices or shape it in any way. And of course I did. I mean, there's no way around it. I mean, I'm the one that wrote the book. There's no way around that. But I wanted to write a book that both captured the drama and the stakes on the terms of the miners themselves, the way that they explained them, and gave the reader, like, really sort of brought the reader into that moment, into the world described by the miners, which I found fascinating. I mean, I'm a writer, so I like to write more than I like to talk. So, by the way, I hope this goes well today, because I prefer to write and talk about the things that I'm interested in. I'm better that way. But so I like to write, but yeah, I loved to. I mean, this was one of the most satisfying writing project I've had in my life. I mean, I being able to get in an archive was like this incredible privilege to be invited into those communities and those lives, and to understand in a really meaningful way, like, what it meant, what was at stake. Because what I realized, it wasn't until I heard their words that I understood, like, what was at stake for them. Because it was, who knows how to mine? Unless you're a miner, you have no idea what's going on underground, right? And they were using hand tools and black powder, and no one understood how dangerous it was and how much skill it required. And despite being the lowest paying job you could have possibly gotten in the United States at the time. And just to hear them describe, like, the way that their labor process was organized, the way the coal companies tried to manipulate their labor process in all these ways that would have made no sense had you not, if you don't hear their words explaining it, help really, I think, elevate both the incredible victory that it was just to be able to produce the solidarity to launch that strike in the first place, and also, like, how remarkable it was that they did what they did at all. It just was really, really remarkable. And so I mean, in some ways, I try to like write this from the perspective of miners as much as I could, by using their words as my guide, and that's what I try to do. And that, by the way, I'll give you the citation for that archive if you ever want to go see it. I copied most of it, so I'll send you the PDF. It's 10,000 pages, Kim. I'm happy to share it with you. It's incredible. I mean, it's really...
You're really selling it, in fairness.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you have to be really interested in the topic to be able to just read a 10,000 page transcript of a court hearing.
Yep.
But I guarantee you, like, you would be transfixed just by that. In fact, I should have just published that. I don't know if Haymarket would have gone for that, but it probably would have been just, or maybe as an appendix. A 10,000 page appendix might have been a little bit much for them, but it would have been worth it.
Do it as a podcast.
Yes, actually, we should, Kim, maybe this could be episode 1 of a podcast. It's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to follow up on that question that Kim asked, and I'll say a few things about what this book made me think about with respect to your choices at the level of the page, David. And if there's more to say, please say it, and if not, we can move on. But to me, because there's the choice about, like, foregrounding the voices of the people you're interviewing if you're doing active ethnographic work, or the people whose voices you find in the archive, and there's there's ways to do that on the page, but I don't know. And I should say that, you have this like extensive, citation list in the back, like an academic book would have, of all the different archives you plumbed, to find your material. But I don't know that I've ever read a book that reads this way, where like your words actually, like you make choices at the level of the writing, where your words merge with those of, I don't quite know what to call them, because they're not, it's more than like your research informants or even like your interlocutors. It feels like these are active protagonists and antagonists in, clearly it's a historical struggle, but it feels like an active struggle in some ways for like the historical record, right? And you make that point, I think, very early on in the introduction. You said it before, that like the history of this period is entirely incomplete because it's been told from these very other kinds of sectarian perspectives. And you're making this choice to tell it in a differently sectarian perspective, one that's really committed to a certain voice. And I feel like that translates into the choices you make on the page. And I'll say one more thing, and then I'll turn it over to you to see if that raises anything for you. I read your book around the same time that I was going back through a different book that also came out in the last year to write a review of it. It's Orasanmi Burton's Tip of the Spear, which is about what he calls the Long Attica Revolt. And Orasanmi makes similar kinds of choices and arguments in what he calls like an archival war. And he's making the case for the prison as war, and that the way that Attica has been told has been through what he calls like the carceral archive. And so in going and actually interviewing and going to the oral histories of 60 plus imprisoned rebels, he's both like uncovering and choosing this kind of like counter archive in this kind of epistemological war that's part of this larger war. And I feel like you're doing something very similar here, both in like what you're choosing to put in the book and the very way in which you write it, which is just so different.
Yeah, you're the 30th person that told me I have to read Tip of the Spear. I have to. I'm remiss in not having read them. To me, I read a lot of stuff that's historical, and to me, history is a terrain of struggle.
Yeah,
working people, like our working people's histories aren't just tales from the past. This is how we fight the struggles in the present, and it doesn't take long to recognize that the histories of the 1902 strike have gotten it wrong, and partly it's not the fault of like contemporary historians or writers interested in labor, because we were lied to by those who came before us, who told us, oh, it was a great victory for labor. Chalk it up, just don't have to worry about looking at that again, because labor won, established the UMW for these reasons, but the only way you would conclude that is if you understood the strike from the perspective of people who hated the miners. They were despised. The union, much of the union resisted organizing them for years. The coal company, they hated the miners, and so I was trying to like, how do I write against that? And partly I sort of, as I read their words in that transcript, I was like, okay, what's my, how can I contribute to this struggle? Because I think when you read this, it was 1902, so it's 122 years ago, but this doesn't seem like it was 122 years old. Like what they were doing and the way they were organized, it's the same, right? Their issues are the same. The way they organized was the same. Everything they were trying to confront are all the same issues and all the same ways that union organizers and activists are doing it today. And they're confronting all the same ways that they're demonized, and all the same ways that they're called terrorists, and all the same ways that they're criminalized. And so I saw, like, in reading the minutes of the union meetings and also reading the transcript of them talking in the arbitration hearing, that they recognized that, and they were trying to organize themselves against that, to push back against that, and none of that found its way into any of the histories of the strike. So yeah, I wanted to figure out a way to do it in a way that had the greatest impact and captured their world as best I could. And so I decided, and I think in some ways I was really, Saidiya Hartman's work and Wayward Lives, beautiful, that her, particularly Venus in Two Acts, her essay. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Saidiya Hartman's work, but the way that she approaches archives, just refusing sort of dominant narratives, refusing to allow the silences in archives become silences in her own work, really influenced me. And I was like, all right, how do I translate this into this project? So, I got rid of quotation marks entirely. So I'm using italics in the book. And the idea here is there's so many quotations that it would have just been ridiculous to just have quotation marks. You would lose track of what is and isn't a quotation. You would just lose track of it. And there was no way that I could, that would work. And so I use italics. And then I realized when I use italics, that like, it's almost like a brand on the page. Then their words are like when you're reading the italics, you're brought into their world in a way. I mean, that was my hope, at least. And then I recognized that it gave me a way to sort of also like, it gave me I felt a license then to like be in their world. So now I can write in a way that my language is not an addendum, or I'm not clarifying anything they're saying. My job isn't to like explain anything that you're reading that the miners are saying, but rather to just like deepen the scene setting of the world that they're describing. That was what I was trying to do. And I don't know how successful I am on that. I was nervous about taking that approach. I didn't know how it would be received. Like I could totally imagine someone saying, you're like speaking, you're like, you're speaking for the dead, you're like, what authority do you have to speak in the words of others? But I thought it really mattered the way that because it wasn't just the language that I used. I mean, I organized it the way that they organized themselves. Like the book itself, the structure of the book adopts the structure of the union campaign. So I'm trying to, and ultimately, honestly, like, I want to take the reader seriously. Like, I think if you're going to read this book, you deserve to like be brought into that world. And so I wanted the reader's experience to be as immersive as mine had felt like when I was reading this transcription. So like, I thought that kind of language and that approach to writing it might capture that and might give the reader a glimpse of like, like the stakes of that moment and all of the consequences and implications of the decisions and the tactics and the strategies, and also explain like the violence as well, because there was an awful lot of violence. I think that you can't write stories about union struggles like this without confronting the violence, both the violence of police and the defensive violence of the miners. But how do you write about that without it being like, without celebrating it or romanticizing it? And I wanted to just, using their language, they were so clear-eyed about it, and so fatalistic in a lot of ways, because they confronted death all the time. As I pointed in the book, like productivity in Pennsylvania was defined according to the amount of coal mined by miners killed. So like their mortality they faced every single day they walked into the mine. I wanted to capture that somehow as well. So that was the way I did it. And I don't know how successful I was at that. I felt like I had sort of captured some of that by really turning over the book to their voices. And I hope that readers get get a sense that they're really literally in the coal fields when they're reading the book.
Mhm.
And also, by the way, I wanted to ask, that made me think of like, you know, I also in writing this recognize like there's certain historical figures that have sort of like flattened for us. And like there's two in particular. There's a question from YouTube that they just posted. Someone asked more about John Mitchell, while a reformist, he has real respect for the voices of the miners. In this sense, contrast with Lewis's later. I don't know who asked that question, but like that's basically, I couldn't agree more. The question is, could you say more about John Mitchell? While a reformist, he has a real respect for the voices of the miners, and in this sense, contrasts with Lewis's later behavior. And then also like Mother Jones. So let me just say something quickly about John Mitchell, and then I wanted to ask Kim a question about Mother Jones. First of all, John Mitchell, what a remarkable figure John Mitchell was. I mean, I think it's fair to call him a reformist, but also not fair. You know, like he was in an impossible position. He understood that the only thing he could do for the miners that mattered in any way as a labor leader required that he actually engage with people he despised and who despised him, all these coal company presidents and these senators and all these people. And he like threw himself into work that must have been just miserable, talking, you know, dealing with these people. And also, and while he opposed the strike in 1902, he had a chance to call it off, and he refused to. And he was very clear with the miners at the convention in which they actually voted to strike that like you're here to make the final decision. He cautioned them not to do it, but the reason he cautioned them not to call that strike in 1902 was because he recognized the stakes and saw correctly what was arrayed against them. And what was arrayed against them was an entire army, the entire Pennsylvania National Guard, and thousands of police, and they were out to destroy the United Mine Workers. And that had, but in 1902, let's be clear, like the miners in 1902, particularly the ones that were in their 50s and 60s, had spent like their entire lives watching union after union get destroyed by snitches and infiltrators and be divided by coal companies through tactics like blacklists, and you know and when that would happen, like their lives, it was just further misery going forward for them. And John Mitchell thought the stakes were just too great to risk that strike in 1902. And so he was banking on incremental benefits until the union could be strong enough to more directly confront the coal companies. So he's much different than Lewis. He's much different than the United Mine Worker leaders that come after him. He was a miner himself. I mean, he born in Illinois, worked underground, you know, like self-educated, somehow made it to law school, like studying at night while working underground as a miner. Like he was loved and respected by the miners, all 150,000, even those that disagreed with him. So John Mitchell was, and I hope that I capture all of his contradictions and you know, the real person who was John Mitchell. And the other figure that I found fascinating, and this was Mother Jones, who I've been thinking like there's no, like Mother Jones was not the only sort of like Mother Jones-like figure in like early labor history. There were these sort of like grandmotherly figures that had this moral authority that I don't recognize as a role play today. And we could talk about what that is. But I was going back today and reading some parts of Fight Like Hell, Kim, your book, and you know, you write about Mother Jones, and I think that, you know, as I was saying to you off camera before we were talking, you're one of the few journalists and people that write about labor that cares as much about struggles that confront working people today as you are interested in like these histories going back 100 years, and you know, like, and I think understanding people like John Mitchell and Mother Jones is crucial to understanding like you know, the sort of the origins of union organizing and these histories of particular unions, and what is possible and what isn't. You decided to write about Mother Jones, right? And I think you recognize her as a pretty important figure in the labor.
I mean, how can you not write about Mother Jones if you're writing about American labor history? I mean, some people have managed it, though I wouldn't recommend it, because she was one of those. It's hard to, I guess, explain what she was like to folks living now, because that was the time when it wasn't that hard to be famous, because there were fewer people. And someone like her who traveled the country giving speeches and raising hell and organizing workers as well, she was younger than she said she was. She got involved in the mine workers and labor movement in her 50s after living a really tragic life.
Yeah.
She kind of reinvented herself and created this character of Mother Jones in her widow's weeds and her little hat and her ruff and her thick Irish accent. She had this sort of like Meemaw from hell vibe to her. I think really resonated and still resonates with people, right? And I think she was just one of those people that she stood out and she stood up for things. Like, she was thrown into prison. Like, she berated various presidents on workers' behalf. She was obviously a flawed person, like all of us, like a lot of early labor leaders, right? Like, she had her prejudices, but she was still just so impactful. And I think you can see that presence and see that impact now. Like, even when I think about going to Alabama when I was covering the Warrior Met Coal Strike in 2021 and 2022, 2023, the older women, the elders, the grandmas, and the older aunties, like those women really held those communities together. And I think that is very much still a big part of the movement. We just don't necessarily have our one, like, newspaper standard bearer. Though the way she played with gender too, I think, was really part of her power. Like, I've talked to Sarah Nelson, the president of the AFA-CWA Flight Attendants Union, who was an incredibly powerful modern labor leader. We've talked about what it's like to be a woman in these spaces and when to break out the pearls and when to break out the combat boots, and being able to kind of use the perceived limitations or stereotypes around your gender as an advantage. You know, Mother Jones, as an older widowed woman on her own, she was supposed to be frail and quiet and depend on someone else's charity. And she didn't do any of that, though I guess some people probably threw her a few bones to keep being Mother Jones. But she flew against those stereotypes of what she was supposed to be. And there's so many characters like that throughout history, like from Lucy Parsons to Emma Tenayuka to the workers on strike at AT&T right now, or knocking doors for Unite here in West Philly. Like, it's the power of and not to even just be fully gendery about it, but an unexpected figure showing up and raising hell. The people don't know what to do with that. And that little bit of surprise or discomfort or just confusion can give you an edge when you really need it. And I think she exploited that in all the best ways.
Yeah, and she had, I mean, she was a rabble-rouser and had the ear of John Mitchell. I mean, that was what was really remarkable. Also the clarity of, like, she criticized the decision to go to arbitration in 1902, and the way she explained it was just so remarkable. And there was no one else that could say that, right? Like, there was this, like, from this position she had created, where she inhabited, she could with her, you know, with the shawl over her shoulders, say the most radical things possible, and shift, like, opinions, particularly among miners who really respected her. I mean, I think for me, it's like, I recognized at the beginning, like, okay, John Mitchell takes Mother Jones seriously, so I can take John Mitchell seriously. Like, you know, they talk constantly during the strike, and she was in the coalfields constantly during the strike, and she was a key, like, figure to raise public opinion and interest, but also, like, strategy. Yeah. She was involved in, like, on the ground tactics and strategy. It's really remarkable.
I love talking about Mother Jones. And just acknowledging that she wasn't just this character, she was a tactician, she was an organizer, like she really lived it. And people paid attention to her because they knew that she knew what she was doing, and because the miners trusted her. They were her boys, they were her adopted family. All she wanted to do was protect them. And sometimes that didn't work out the way that we would have wanted to. But yeah, I mean, what a great, like, when you're writing this book, you have so many characters, so many people, so many miners and families, and then you've got this larger than life character that just kind of swoops in, and you get about her too.
she's sort of like the archangel of like the miners. Yeah, that is kind of the role she plays.
Oh man, we're talking a lot about history and about finding workers' voices from back then and why it's so crucial to look back to where it came from. But your work concentrates, it kind of straddles that line too of explaining how we got here from those earlier days, and really builds up this just really crucial timeline to explaining what happened once the extraction changed, once the miners stopped being the dominant labor force. What happened? Where did the people go? Where did the oppressed and marginalized people go? And you've behind bars, essentially.
Yeah, behind bars. Well, into the prisons. Some of them behind the bars, right? And I should talk about that in detail because it's particularly acute in this moment. And of course, some of them on the outside of the bars as the sort of disseminators of state violence. And this is sort of the most tragic thing at the moment is that, obviously I probably don't need to tell anybody on this call tuning in, right? Like we are, we have 2 million people in prisons and jails. Like there's, maybe it's important to give a little bit of context, like to the just like carceral geography of the place. There's 16 prisons where I live, like in Central Appalachia. That's at every scale, right? So there's like tons of county jails everywhere. They're all overcrowded. There's state prisons. They're growing and being expanded upon. And then there's actually the densest concentration of federal prisons in the United States or in Eastern Kentucky. So at every scale, every scale of the state, the carceral state has sort of expanded, and it is really in very explicit, concrete ways a response to these crises that you're naming, Kim, very explicitly, whether it's like a crisis of revenue decline because of the precipitous drop in coal production and the way that there are these mechanisms that were in place that used to bring lots of tax receipts to the coal fields for like basic, infrastructure stuff and county maintenance stuff. And in very concrete ways that jails are now used to sort of shore up that loss. Whether it's that or, prisons being proposed as they're always proposed in rural communities as like a rural jobs program. There's now in Kentucky, I haven't looked for about a year, but the last I looked, there's something like 4,000 mining jobs left in the state of Kentucky. And I should say that's split between the Western Kentucky coal fields, which is not Appalachia, and the Eastern Kentucky coal fields, which is, right? So 4,000 total in the state of Kentucky and 8,000 plus correctional officer jobs. So the prison and jail jobs have not only displaced the mining jobs, but have doubled them, and then some, most likely. And at the same time, that doesn't come close to, it's like a tenth of the number of mining jobs that were in the state of Kentucky at the height of mining in 1950. There were like 75 or 80,000 mining jobs in the state. So there's this like weird contradiction where it's like the prisons are sort of like proposed as this sort of putative solution to structural unemployment, and at the same time they don't come close to providing actual economic development. What they do sometimes do is allow for these kinds of community level social reproduction efforts, like being able to fund community centers or build out a road or extend a water line, like very sort of mundane municipal governance stuff. They do get kind of integrated into those planning and development initiatives. The other thing that I should say here, and then I can, transition back to David, is the most recent data we have is that like in Kentucky, so Kentucky has like a particularly high rate of incarceration. And what's fueling that is people from rural communities getting locked up in jails and prisons. So we're now in this moment where, as I said at the outset of these comments, like you have the prisons being bringing people in through two mechanisms, through criminalization and incarceration on the one hand, and the promises of employment on the other. And in doing so, there's this argument I make in the book where, like, there's this long storied legacy that you both are experts in of, militant organizing and even insurrection of course, in the anthracite coal fields and down here in the bituminous coal fields of, and you had mine guards and cops and Pinkertons and whatnot, and the coal companies obviously on the one hand, and then miners on the other. And part of what I think is at least threatening to happen is the integration of those two populations into one, which is the correctional officer, right? Mine guard and miner, into one sort of subjectivity, right? That's now the kind of face of police power in the coal fields. That, of course, doesn't happen without lots of opposition and organizing. And I'm just going to plug a fight that we're in at the moment, which is the fight against a proposed new federal prison, now in its 20th year of we're in 20 years into the fight, basically, in southeastern Kentucky in Letcher County. So this is not to say this is just like some process that's rolling everyone over. There's lots of opposition and really incredible organizing that's happening. But I do think those are the stakes of what's happening.
Yeah, I was thinking about in reading the transcript of this strike about that sort of contemporary set of conditions. I mean, I got my PhD in Kentucky, so I have some familiarity with the region and Appalachia, and I wanted to be able to tell a kind of prehistory to the story you just told. There's a long effort by coal companies and coal carrying railroads to produce the kind of sort of like industrial stability that will give them the opportunity to establish control, political and economic control, in exactly the way that lets them just, they try to control every aspect of political and economic life in eastern Pennsylvania. That's the goal. The goal, in order to run a profitable coal mine, you have to control everything. You have to control every part of sort of political and economic life. And so all the coal company executives were also like cops, right? Like they were the cops, they were the coal company executives, and they were the politicians. So like that remains the same. That's still the sort of pattern. And I think like this question of like these sort of like these moments of sort of like insurrection, and I love that. I love this word because that's really what it is. Come out of these crisis moments, and for me, 1902 was crucial. There's a question on YouTube, like, can you say how the miners overcame the things that divided them? And I think the only way to understand how 1902 happened is by going a little bit back and understanding the migration from Eastern, Central, and Southern Europe to Pennsylvania beginning in like 1890. Like that's crucial. That was not an accident. They were recruiting specifically non-Irish, non-Welsh miners into the coal fields that didn't speak English, and so and taking advantage of the conditions in Europe that were sending so many people, literally recruiting in Europe to bring people. But that like backfired. And then this is the great thing about the sort of the designs of these sort of like wealthy coal company presidents and like in their efforts to reshape society and their image and capital's image, they produce conditions that spiral out of their control and produce sort of like modes of resistance that they didn't anticipate. So, for example, like in trying to understand what happened in 1902, you have to understand like the Latimer massacre, for example, in 1897, in which the Eastern European miners, when they came to the coal fields, didn't see the Irish and Welsh miners as their comrades or their allies. the way that the like mining was structured and organized, there were like layers of bosses, so many fucking bosses. And even workers were made into bosses. And so like the Irish, particularly the Welsh and English miners, were contract miners, and they had their own employees. So it was impossible for the United Mine Workers for years to organize effectively, because you'd be in a local with a guy who was paying your wage. And so like these like Eastern European miners were like, what do I have in common with this English contractor who pays my wage and actually cheats me on this wage? And we're in the same union. And so, and also they would see, Irish miners in the northern, like the Wyoming Valley, lay down their tools, and then they'd watch miners in the Schuylkill County go take their jobs. So they didn't trust, because of course the Schuylkill miners in the sort of southern coal fields, literally the geology of the coal required different methods, and so the actual grievances and the issues of miners in one region were never the same as another. So it wasn't just that the coal companies divided the union by like race and ethnicity and language, but the way they actually mined produced divisions in the union that made it really difficult to even like launch a strike, much less like one that could sustain a 5-month campaign like the one that they did in 1902. So the Eastern European miners just said, the hell with the United Mine Workers, we're going to go on our own. And they would launch like wildcat work stoppages really beginning in the early 1890s that were just remarkable in the sort of ferocity and solidarity that they had among themselves. And it was all like the United Mine Workers didn't know what to make of it, right? So like John Mitchell was sort of scared of it. He didn't know how to control it. He didn't know because they would discipline themselves, right? So if once the coal companies would bring cops up on the trains, the non-English speaking miners would just catch them at the train station, beat the hell out of them, and throw them in a river. They would, if any local merchant would sell anything to a scab, they would burn down the merchant's bill. I mean, just their children would throw rocks at the other children at school. The way that they understood solidarity was life or death. This wasn't like, it wasn't a question of like, tactics and strategies for them mattered only as so far as they could win, and if it served their interests, it didn't matter what it was, and violence was among their most important tactics. And it wasn't until after Latimer, when 19 miners are just slaughtered on the road to Latimer, and they were all of them were like Polish, Lithuanian miners. These weren't, the United Mine Workers recognized, like, instead of organizing them, we should maybe join them. And so the way that the United Mine Workers overcame the divisions that had defined the union prior to 1902 was by just dispensing with the idea that they needed to somehow educate these Eastern and Central and Southern European miners in what like union organizing was in the United States. Because that's, that was progressive era, the conservative union organizing at the time, and we're at the beginning of that period, was really about sort of like a process of Americanization, right? This is how we do things in America. The goal is industrial stability. That wasn't their goal. And it wasn't until the mine workers sort of like accepted the sort of radical militancy as a key central tactic of their strategies that they had any success. And it didn't hurt that people then could trust, like the others could trust each other. They knew that no one was going to cross the picket line because there were consequences if you crossed the picket line in 1902. I mean, as I write about in the book, they would march around at dawn in every town, going from door to door, making sure nobody crossed the picket line. And if they did cross the picket line, there were consequences to come home and find a grave dug in your front yard, and the word scab painted on the side of your house, and an effigy of you hanging in front of your front door. They were demonized for this, and historians for decades have been writing about, these violent miners. You have to understand the violence that they confronted every day in the mine, I mean, on an average day, 9 miners were pulled from the mines dead or like injured and would never work again. Every day.
Mm-hmm.
Every day. And they made $1 a day. So their lives were already defined by incredible violence. And so you have to recognize the context in which they were fighting to understand their tactics. And it was when the United Mine Workers, and I think that's the genius of John Mitchell. John Mitchell could talk like a business union steward, but he understood where the real power in the union was. And it was in that sort of like militant solidarity of these miners that we only win if we all win, and nobody can cross the picket line. If you cross the picket line, like your life in that region was over. Like priests would not give you last rites. Like you couldn't get a loan if you crossed the picket line. You couldn't buy bread if you crossed the picket line. There were consequences to this, and that's how they overcame the divisions that up until 1902 had made it impossible for them to confront capital. Capital had completely claimed the authority to use violence against the miners, and it was when the miners willingly used it against the coal companies that they were actually able to bridge the divides. And it's not, I'm not romanticizing the violence of the strike. I think it's important to understand like the choices they made about it and where it came from, and because it was a principled approach, right? There was, it wasn't just random violence. It recognized like they were in a war, and they had to act accordingly. And they talked about that way too. They talked about it as a war. They understood it as a war. They were soldiers in a war against capital, and that's how they overcame the things that divided them. Imagine doing that today. I mean, it would be a much different. I mean, we couldn't use the similar tactics, but
the larger point is that you're making. Yeah, the larger point you're making is like you can't just abstract these questions about violence versus nonviolence or something like that out of, in this case, out of context generally, and of course in this case out of the context of an actual war taking place in the coal fields, and that it was strategic and debated, and I mean that comes through a lot in the book. There was another moment like that in the book I wanted to ask you about that the previous question actually reminded me of. So the book is really good about doing just what you've said about kind of like putting on the page the way these issues are debated and strategized around and whatnot. And there's a moment, I think it's at the Hazleton Convention, where they vote to go out on strike, and there's a debate about the police, and there's some faction that actually says we might want to consider sort of like being our own police as a way to preempt the inevitable influx of hired gun thugs, the Pinkertons, et cetera. And then the other faction, which I think wins out, which is like, at the end of the day, that means we're like training our guns on ourselves and protecting scabs and whatnot. To me, I mean, that's fascinating on its own, in terms of like a historical conversation that occurred. There are echoes of that today, in like, and certainly like in the last 10 years or so and 2020, around like elements of the movement that might think about community policing or police accountability versus abolition, right? And it's not the same tension exactly, but there were echoes of that I read in that exchange that happened.
Well, and also, I think this is a debate that has never ended, right? It's like, what place do cops have in the union movement, for example? And I mean that you've written about that, Kim, right?
A little bit.
I think I share all of your opinions about this, Kevin. I mean, cops don't belong in the union movement. They're not working people. Like their interests are directly opposed to the interests of working people. And yeah, I mean, to me, it was fascinating the way they had that. They had a very explicit conversation about like, what are we going to do when they send an army of cops against us? Can we preempt it by being cops ourselves? I mean, it was. This is the beginning of a kind of like a reformist. Like, is there a way to do this? How do we do this? And it was like, just like now, there was this vocal minority. It was like, bright line. We can't do it. We'll never do this. It's a slippery slope, and it's and we know where it ends. And they were the ones that were right. They because the way the strike plays out, it very much ends up being the character and the development of policing is what upends their solidarity. And so we're in the middle of it, in the beginning of it. They recognize how important this question was, but only some did. That was the thing I found fascinating. Like for most of there was like 1,000 delegates at the Hazleton Convention when they voted for the strike in 1902. Most of them were like, this isn't even an important issue. Like they didn't even see this as an important issue. It was just taken for granted that there will be cops arrayed against us, and how should we take this seriously, and how should we take this seriously? But there was this vocal minority that took this very, very seriously, and I that's part of why I was really interested in this story in this book, because I think that's missing from a lot of struggles. I mean, like a couple of years ago, the ACLU in New Mexico came out supporting like the jail guards' efforts to like restore their access to less than lethal weapons and use of dogs in prisons. And it was all this, it was this familiar sort of reformist, progressive, like, well, it's better than that. It seems to me that we learned this lesson 122 years ago, and we ought to pay attention. We don't have to continually debate this question. We have plenty of historical examples and evidence that demonstrate what happens when we don't take police seriously when we're engaged in union organizing and working class struggles.
And yet it's such a controversial take in the modern labor union or the labor movement that cops don't belong in our unions or in our union federations or at our conventions. It's in 2020 we saw the rise of a number of different grassroots rank and file groups. There's no cop union, no cop union. It's just Drop the Cops, SEIU. IATSE had a caucus around it. Cop Free AFSCME, which is interesting because they cops. There's this big moment of energy, and the AFL-CIO was like, absolutely not. We're going to do some reform, and you're going to shut up, was essentially the response that was given. And then the COVID pandemic kicked off, and a lot of things got backburnered. But it's still this question that has never received a satisfactory answer of why are we still why are we still being forced to tolerate this? Why are we being made to feel like this is how it should be, when for over a century we've known that cops are here and workers are here, and that line in the middle is generally painted with our blood.
Yeah. That's a good one. I wonder, Kim, do you think, and Judith as well, I mean, the thing that I was struck with when I was writing the book was the way that like the union would make the argument about like reformist, like one of the common arguments John Mitchell would make when he was appealing to like industry to recognize the union, because of course in 1902 there was no way they just ignored the union. There was no law that required them to recognize the union. There was no law that required, or no institution that would force the coal companies to negotiate with the union, right? They were, and in fact, just to be a member of a union was to be a terrorist for a lot of sort of progressive political thinkers at the time. But the way that Mitchell would pitch it, and I know that he was trying to create like a pitch that would appeal to these sorts of like industrialists, but it was like, the more powerful that the larger the labor movement is, the more powerful we are, the more peace there will be, the more industrial peace there will be, because then we can handle and this is the beginning of business unionism, then we can handle the discipline and we can enforce the contract and you can just benefit from it, right? And it was like this appeal to like, if your goal and the entire point of all progressive area politics is like industrial stability, that's a whole goal of it all, right? We need industrial stability. Is like if your goal is industrial stability, then you should support unions, because it's through unions that we can like control the sort of energy of the working class and direct it in ways that will produce industrial stability. That was the sort of like argument. And I think partly Mitchell would say it this way just to appeal. He knew who he was talking to. But he was also adopting a language that was common at the time, right? This was the way that the Republican Party talked. This was the way that like the National Civic Federation talked, which was a really influential group of largely Republican political figures, but also industrial, like industrialists. And that to me is like the logic of like a lot today, we should have cops in our unions. It's sort of this idea that like, well, let's demonstrate our willingness to be open-minded and to reach across the aisle and to recognize that all people are working people in one way or another. And so let's accommodate. It just seems so, the accommodationist sort of nature of it shocks me really when you think about it, because there's no evidence that it ever works. Like, when has it ever helped working people to develop closer ties to cops? I don't know of any historical example of that ever, And so
who's doing the accommodating?
But
where's the outreach from the police unions to every other union? They don't even sit with us. They want nothing to do with the movement. They will actively disaffiliate or try to disaffiliate whenever you make them mad. They endorse anti-union politicians all the time. Like it's very much a one-way sort of outreach program. Like, come sit with us. We believe in your rights to collectively bargain. Like, you're workers too. And the other side's like, yeah, thanks, suckers. Well,
yeah, right. And it seems like the only people that would like advocate for this position, for like building ties between like organized labor and cops, would be people that that don't understand the stakes and the and don't recognize the history that a long history of violence that the unions we have are like curtailed by cops. Like, in other words, it's because of cops that we can only negotiate over wages and working conditions, and it can't be beyond that, right? Like unions aren't social movements because the law has curtailed them, and cops have enforced the law to limit the prospects of working people, particularly when we organize. So it seems such a that reformist line it seems to have so much like life to it. I mean, Tyler Wall and I wrote an entire book, Police and Field Guide, to just explore this idea, because to me, it's just like reformism is just like so obviously a failure when you really consider its goals. Like what reformist like effort has ever produced less violent cops, fewer cops with fewer weapons? Like, no, it always is the opposite. Mm-hmm. And so what effort by any union to bring cops into its orbit has benefited workers in any meaningful way? It's shocking.
And so that's one thing that as a labor history nerd, it just kills me. Whenever I get an email from whatever big labor established force about, remember the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, remember the uprising of the 20,000, who broke Clara Lemlich's ribs on the picket line? Like, all of our most hallowed moments have been ruined by cops. Like, whether we're going to talk about remembering the Ludlow massacre, who was doing the shooting?
Yeah, right.
Who put Mother Jones in jail? Who is out here shooting people all the time? in the subway in New York City. I heard those folks have a great union. You know, like it's it makes me feel like I'm living in a different reality sometimes when you think about things like this. As much as I love the labor movement, I wish that people read more history books, read more books like yours.
Mm-hmm.
And yours, Kim.
And Judah's.
Yes.
This is well an
gonna...
infomercial.
Yeah. Dave, I'm glad you mentioned the field guide book, because you had me when you were talking about the logic that Mitchell was offering about unionization. It reminded me of the phrase you all use in the book of cop speak, and actually very explicitly, it reminded me of the way in this book that you talk about the ways that the formation of the state police were justified. It was using some of those same arguments, right? For being able to it was a reformist initiative, right? To stabilize the social order. They were appealing to the idea of being able to disentangle the police from the companies, to protect working people, right? And there was a lot of the same kinds of arguments for the establishment and expansion of this jurisdictionally broad police force.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, I get to that in the end, right? That's the end of the book when they really start, when they're forming the Pennsylvania State Police. And I think if you don't read this book, but you listen to us here, just let me leave you with this. Every effort to create state police was voted down, and every opportunity that voters from 1905 or even before that in the late 1800s up until the 1920s, every time any state wanted to create a state police, they was overwhelmingly voted down because people understood what it meant. Because they knew what the police were at that time, right? The police existed as a force that operated on behalf of capital to advance capital's interests against working people. And they didn't want that. They didn't want that broadened because they knew what broadening it meant. They would be under that umbrella somehow. That they would be then subject to police authority. And so it was constantly voted down and voted down and voted down. And it wasn't until after the strike of 1902 when they start to depict police as somehow this sort of last line of defense for regular working people. This is the sort of thin blue line argument that Tyler has written so much about, and that we write about in the book. It's that we need cops to protect your working class interests, and they somehow won. They won that argument by stacking the deck, of course, because it was financed by Wall Street. Literally, this whole campaign was financed by Wall Street, and Teddy Roosevelt wrote the foreword to the book that launched the campaign. But it was these familiar sets of absurd, ridiculous promises by reformists that all of your problems will be solved by just more cops. And if we could just create this, but it'll be professional. They'll be trained. You don't want these untrained cops, so we'll get rid of them and we'll have these well-trained cops. And they'll have military experience and we love them. And mostly it's just to protect the rural areas, which are just full of criminals, apparently, just brigands covering all of eastern Pennsylvania that we have to root out, right? And of course, as soon as they create the Pennsylvania State Police, Groom, who's the initial commandant, some reporter asks him, where are you going to put all these troop stations? And he's like, oh, in the coal fields. He's like, we don't need to put them in the rural areas. The coal fields is where we need cops. And that's all they did, right? And so if we just take this history seriously, you'd think that we'd be inoculated against these ridiculous reformist arguments, but we don't take this history seriously. And partly it's because we don't know this history, and that's why I wanted to write this book, because I didn't know this history until I started reading this transcript, and I was shocked. How do I not know this history? Why did this never make it into any book about this strike? How is it possible that this remarkable story sort of escapes our attention and that we just call this strike a victory and forget of the implications and consequences of how it was resolved and the legacy that we today live with, that we still confront, and we don't even know how to confront it because we don't even know how it was created in the first place. That to me is why this kind of like story and why this history is crucially important today. And also I know that facts don't matter anymore, so you better tell a good story. So I hope it's a good story. I've learned this from my students. They just they're not going to listen to facts. They want, it's like, my goal is to make you as a reader immediately in solidarity with the miners.
Mm-hmm.
And we ought to be today. Who demonizes working people today? I mean, the Republican and the Democratic Party demonize regular working people. Both of them do, right? And they always have. And we're not going to be able to get past that stuff and that reformist crap until we start sort of really taking working class histories seriously. And that's what I'm trying to contribute to. I know that you are too, Kim, and I know that you are too, Judah, which is why I'm glad that we're having this conversation. And I hope that this book is a little contribution to that struggle. And also, by the way, I know you have to put it right in front of your face because it gets all blurred.
Blurs in the kitchen.
I don't even have a copy up there. I don't even. I can't. I feel like I wrote this book feeling like there was one last fight for the miners, and I wanted to be a part of it. So this book is my contribution to that. We're going to win the history. They might not have won that strike, but we're going to win the history for this strike, and hopefully this book goes some way toward that.
I feel like that's a beautiful way to wrap up. Unless there's other pressing questions or any other like mic drop moments that David wants to hit us with.
Yeah, I can't like just pull mic drop moments out. Or like they're very precious, as you know. I mean, I can't. I'm glad you think that's a mic drop moment. I mean, I mean it though. I mean, I really feel like the goal I had throughout was like this fight is ongoing. We've talked about all the ways that it is. So this book is part of an ongoing fight. And the best way to help win this fight in the present is to win it in the past.
Mm. A second mic drop moment.
A second mic drop moment, please.
Promises made, promises kept.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Judah and Kim. Like, it's been great to talk about this. I really wanted to have this kind of conversation, and so I'm really grateful to you both for.
We should do a panel somewhere. Or like do an event.
Name it. I'm flying there. Anytime.
Thanks for having a great book.